The light in the estate sale hall had that particular quality of late afternoon in autumn, golden and melancholic, streaming through tall windows that hadn't been cleaned in decades. Dust particles floated in the beams like tiny stars suspended in amber, and the air carried the scent of old paper, mothballs, and something else, something that smelled like time itself, if time could have a fragrance. Margaret Holloway moved through the crowded room with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 30 years appraising objects that most people would dismiss as junk. She was 62 years old, her hair more silver than brown now, pulled back in a loose bun that never quite stayed in place. Her hands, strong and careful, touched each item with a reverence that came from understanding that every object held a story, whether anyone remembered it or not. The Whitmore estate had been one of the grandest properties in New Hampshire, a sprawling Victorian mansion that had stood on the hill overlooking the town for more than a century and a half. Now it was being liquidated, the family line having ended with the death of Eleanor Whitmore, a reclusive woman who had lived alone in the decaying house for 40 years, surrounded by the accumulated possessions of 5 generations. Margaret had been hired by the auction house to catalog the more valuable items before the general sale began, and she approached the task with her usual mixture of professional detachment and genuine curiosity. She had already documented the furniture, the paintings, the china sets, and the jewelry when she noticed a small mahogany box tucked behind a stack of leather-bound books on a shelf in what had once been the library. The box itself was unremarkable, plain wood, about the size of a brick, with simple brass hinges that had tarnished to a dull green. But something about it called to her, the way certain objects sometimes did, as if they were waiting to be found by the right person at the right moment. She lifted the box carefully, feeling its weight in her hands, and carried it to the broad oak desk near the window where she had set up her workspace. The latch opened easily despite its age, and inside, nestled in faded burgundy velvet, lay a pocket watch. Margaret had seen hundreds of pocket watches in her career. They were common enough at estate sales, usually cheap silver-plated things that had been given as retirement gifts or graduation presents. But this one was different. Even before she picked it up, she could tell it was exceptional. The case was gold, genuine 18-karat gold, and the craftsmanship was exquisite. The front cover bore an engraved design of acanthus leaves surrounding a blank cartouche where a monogram might have been placed but never was. She pressed the crown, and the cover sprang open with a soft click that seemed impossibly crisp for something that had been closed for who knew how long. The dial inside was porcelain white with Roman numerals in black enamel, and the hands were delicate blue steel, frozen at 8 minutes past 3. The watch had stopped long ago, but the mechanism behind the dial still gleamed with the precision of Swiss engineering. Margaret turned it over in her hand, admiring the weight of it, the feel of real gold warming against her palm, and that's when she saw it. A small button on the edge of the case, almost invisible, designed to release the back cover. She pressed it gently, and the back plate swung open to reveal the movement inside, a maze of gears and springs and jeweled bearings that glittered in the afternoon light like a tiny mechanical universe. But it wasn't the movement that made her breath catch in her throat. It was the symbol engraved on the inner surface of the back plate, barely larger than her thumbnail, but perfectly clear and unmistakable. A triangle with radiating lines, an eye in the center, and beneath it, in letters so small she almost needed a magnifying glass to read them, 3 words: Ordo Lucas Eterni. Where are you calling from? I want to know. Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. Margaret had studied art history in college, decades ago, and she had seen enough occult symbolism in old paintings and manuscripts to recognize what she was looking at. The all-seeing eye, the symbol of secret societies, of Freemasons and Illuminati and a dozen other groups that had flourished in the shadows of the 18th and 19th centuries. But this wasn't the Masonic version she knew from history books. This was something else. The Latin phrase translated to Order of the Eternal Light, a name she had never encountered in any of her research, and the style of the engraving suggested it had been done at the same time the watch was made, not added later. She pulled out her phone and took a series of photographs, capturing every angle of the watch, the symbol, the inscription, the serial number etched on the movement's main plate. Then she carefully closed the back cover and sat for a long moment, turning the watch over in her hands, feeling the weight of it not just physically but existentially, as if this small golden object had suddenly become a door to something vast and dark and hidden. She had been doing estate appraisals long enough to know that most secrets died with their keepers, that most mysteries dissolved into mundane explanations once you dug deep enough. But she also knew that sometimes, very rarely, you stumbled onto something real, something that had been deliberately concealed because the truth of it was too dangerous or too valuable or too strange to be exposed to daylight. And this watch, she was certain, was one of those things. The next morning, Margaret sat at her desk in her small apartment above the antique shop she had owned for 20 years, the pocket watch on a velvet cloth in front of her, her laptop open to a dozen browser tabs filled with search results. She had spent most of the night reading about secret societies in New England, about watchmakers in the 1880s, about symbols and codes and the hidden infrastructure of power that had existed beneath the surface of respectable 19th-century American life. What she found was both more and less than she had expected. The Order of the Eternal Light appeared in exactly 3 historical documents that she could locate through online archives and academic databases. The first was a brief mention in a letter written in 1889 by a Boston minister named Reverend Thomas Ashford, who warned his congregation about the dangers of heretical groups that claimed to possess secret knowledge of divine truth. The second was a footnote in an obscure history of New Hampshire published in 1923, which mentioned that several prominent citizens of Concord had been rumored to belong to a philosophical society called the Eternal Light in the years following the Civil War. The third reference was the most disturbing, a newspaper article from 1891, reprinted in a collection of historical mysteries, which described the disappearance of a young woman named Sarah Cunningham, whose father had accused a group of wealthy men, allegedly members of something called the Order of Lucas Aeterni, of having abducted her for purposes the article did not specify. The case had never been solved. Sarah Cunningham had never been found. The accusations had been dismissed as the ravings of a grief-stricken father, and the men named in his statement had all provided alibis and threatened lawsuits until the matter was quietly dropped. Margaret sat back in her chair and stared at the watch. The Whitmore family had been one of those prominent families. She knew that much from the auction house briefing. Jonathan Whitmore, who had built the mansion in 1874, had been a railroad magnate, a banker, a philanthropist who had funded the construction of the town library and the local hospital. His son, Robert Whitmore, had inherited the fortune and the house and had lived there until his death in 1923. It was Robert's grandson who had sold off most of the family assets during the Depression, and it was Robert's great-granddaughter, Eleanor, who had died alone in the decaying mansion just 3 months ago, leaving no heirs and no will, just a house full of forgotten things. Margaret picked up the watch again and examined the serial number she had photographed the day before. She had already sent an inquiry to the Swiss Watchmaking Museum in Geneva, along with detailed images, asking if they could identify the maker and the date of manufacture. She didn't expect a response for several days, but she was a patient woman, and she had learned that the best research was methodical, not rushed. What troubled her was the growing certainty that this watch had not simply been a possession of the Whitmore family. It had been a symbol, a token, perhaps even a key to something that the family had been part of, something that had required absolute secrecy and absolute loyalty. She thought about the young woman, Sarah Cunningham, who had vanished in 1891, the same decade the watch had been made. She thought about the careful engraving of the symbol, the deliberate concealment of it beneath the outer case, the fact that the watch had been kept in a locked box in a library that no one had entered in decades. And she thought about the words Eleanor Whitmore had supposedly said to the hospice nurse who had attended her in her final days, words that had been mentioned in the estate lawyer's notes almost as an afterthought. They made us promise never to speak of it, never to open the box, never to let the light go out. At the time, everyone had assumed the old woman was delirious, her mind unraveling in the approach of death. But now, holding the watch, Margaret wondered if Eleanor had been trying to issue a warning, if she had known what was in the box and what it meant, and if her lifetime of silence had been the fulfillment of a promise made generations before by someone who had understood the cost of breaking it. 3 days later, the email from Geneva arrived. Margaret opened it with trembling hands, her coffee forgotten and growing cold beside her keyboard. The response was professional and detailed, written by a curator named Dr. Heinrich Mahler, who specialized in 19th-century Swiss watchmaking. He confirmed that the watch had been manufactured in 1887 by the firm of Patek Philippe, one of the most prestigious names in horology, and that it was a custom commission, not part of any standard production line. The serial number corresponded to a batch of 12 watches that had been made for a private client in the United States, all identical in design, all bearing the same internal engraving, though Dr. Mahler noted that Patek Philippe's records did not specify what the engraving depicted or what it signified. The firm had been paid in gold, an unusual arrangement even for wealthy clients, and the watches had been shipped to a private address in Concord, New Hampshire, in October of 1887. The client's name was listed simply as J.W., with no further identification. Margaret read the email 3 times, absorbing every detail, and then she did something she rarely allowed herself to do. She let intuition guide her next move. She picked up the phone and called the New Hampshire Historical Society, asking to speak with anyone who specialized in the post-Civil War period and the social history of the state's elite families. She was transferred twice before she reached a researcher named Daniel Park, a man in his 40s with a voice that suggested he spent more time with documents than with people. She explained that she was researching a family named Whitmore and asked if he knew anything about secret societies or fraternal organizations that might have operated in the region during the 1880s and 1890s. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then Daniel said, carefully, that he might know something, but it wasn't the kind of information that appeared in official histories. He suggested they meet in person, and Margaret agreed immediately. They met 2 days later in a coffee shop near the State House in Concord, a small brick building that had probably been standing since before the Whitmores built their mansion. Daniel Park was younger than his voice had suggested, with wire-rimmed glasses and the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who cared more about ideas than about appearances. He carried a leather satchel stuffed with papers and notebooks, and when Margaret showed him the photographs of the watch and the symbol, his expression shifted from polite interest to something closer to alarm. He asked if he could examine the watch in person, and Margaret, who had brought it with her wrapped in velvet and secured in a small lockbox, agreed. They went to his office in the Historical Society building, a cramped room lined with filing cabinets and shelves sagging under the weight of old ledgers and photograph albums. Daniel closed the door and pulled the blinds, and only then did Margaret realize that he was frightened. He held the watch with the same care she had, turning it over, opening the back plate, studying the symbol with a magnifying glass he pulled from his desk drawer. Finally, he set it down and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, part fascination, part dread. He told her that he had been researching the social networks of New England's Gilded Age elite for his doctoral dissertation, which had never been published because his findings had been too controversial, too unverifiable, too dangerous to the reputations of families that still held power and influence in the state. He had uncovered evidence of a secret society that had operated between roughly 1870 and 1920, a group that called itself the Order of the Eternal Light, made up of industrialists, bankers, politicians, and judges who believed they had been chosen to guide the course of human civilization according to principles they claimed were divinely inspired. The order had no written charter that survived, no membership rolls, no public acknowledgement of its existence, but Daniel had pieced together fragments from private letters, from diaries that had been donated to archives by unsuspecting descendants, from coded references in newspaper editorials and society columns. The members had communicated through symbols, through objects like this watch, through meetings held in private homes and in lodges that officially belonged to other, more respectable organizations. And they had done things, Daniel said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper, things that would never be forgiven if they came to light. He told Margaret about rituals that involved psychological manipulation, about young women who had been inducted into what the order called auxiliary circles, promised education and advancement and then coerced into relationships with powerful men who saw them as possessions rather than people. He told her about financial schemes that had ruined competitors and enriched members, about political appointments that had been bought and sold, about at least 4 deaths, 2 suicides and 2 accidents, that he believed were actually murders arranged to silence members who had threatened to expose the order's activities. And he told her about the watches. 12 of them, given to the 12 founding members of the order in 1887, each one a symbol of their bond and their shared secrets, each one engraved with the mark that identified them to one another. The watches were supposed to be passed down, Daniel explained, from father to son, from master to chosen successor, as long as the order endured. But something had happened in the early 1920s, something that had caused the order to fracture and dissolve. Daniel didn't know the full story, no one did, but the fragments he had found suggested a scandal, a betrayal, possibly a crime so serious that even the members' wealth and influence couldn't protect them. After that, the watches had disappeared. Some had been destroyed. Others had been hidden. And the families that had been part of the order had spent the next century trying to erase every trace of their involvement, burning letters, destroying photographs, threatening lawsuits against anyone who asked too many questions. Margaret listened to all of this with a growing sense of unease that bordered on nausea. She asked Daniel why he was telling her this, why he hadn't published his research or taken it to journalists who could bring it to public attention. He laughed, a short bitter sound, and told her that he had tried. He had been threatened with legal action by 3 different law firms representing descendants of order families. He had been denied tenure at 2 universities after senior faculty members, whose own families had connections to the people he was researching, had blocked his appointments. He had been followed, his apartment had been broken into, and once, just once, he had received a phone call from a man who knew his daily routine, knew where his sister lived, knew the names of his nephews, and had suggested, politely, that some research was better left unfinished. After that, Daniel had stopped. He had locked his files away, taken a safe job cataloging documents for the Historical Society, and convinced himself that the past could stay buried. But now, looking at the watch, he realized that the past was never really buried, it was just waiting. Margaret asked him what he thought she should do. Daniel was silent for a long moment, and then he said that it depended on what she wanted. If she wanted to sell the watch, she could find a private collector who would pay a fortune for it, no questions asked, and she could walk away with enough money to retire comfortably and never think about the Order of the Eternal Light again. But if she wanted the truth, if she believed that history mattered and that the people who had been hurt by these men deserved to have their stories told, then she would have to dig deeper, and she would have to accept that digging came with risks. He offered to help her, cautiously, if she promised to be careful, if she agreed that they would document everything, verify everything, and make sure that whatever they found was preserved in multiple places so that it couldn't be destroyed or suppressed. Margaret didn't hesitate. She told him yes. She had spent her entire career handling the remnants of other people's lives, cataloging their possessions, appraising their value in dollars and cents, but she had never really understood what those objects meant until now. This watch wasn't just a piece of gold and gears. It was evidence. It was testimony. And she was going to make sure it spoke. Over the next 3 weeks, Margaret and Daniel worked together in a quiet frenzy of research, cross-referencing names and dates, tracking down descendants of families who had lived in Concord during the relevant period, requesting documents from archives in Boston and New York and Philadelphia. They discovered that Jonathan Whitmore had been one of the founding members of the order, that he had hosted meetings in the mansion on the hill, that his library, the same library where Margaret had found the watch, had been the site of initiation ceremonies that new members described in coded language as transformative, as illuminating, as the moment when they understood their true purpose in life. They found a diary entry written by Robert Whitmore in 1891, the year Sarah Cunningham disappeared, in which he expressed guilt over something he called the necessary sacrifice and prayed for forgiveness for sins he could not name. They found a photograph from 1889, a formal portrait of 12 men standing in front of the Whitmore mansion, all of them wearing identical dark suits, all of them with their hands positioned in a specific way, left hand over the heart, right hand at their side, that Daniel recognized as a symbol of the order. And they found in the records of a sanatorium in Vermont, the admission file of a woman named Catherine Lowell, who had been committed in 1920 at the age of 43 and had died there 6 months later. Catherine had been the daughter of one of the order's members, and her commitment papers, signed by 2 doctors and a judge who were also members, stated that she was suffering from delusions and hysteria. But the notes from the attending physician told a different story. Catherine had claimed that she had been forced to participate in rituals, that she had been assaulted by men her father considered friends, that she had given birth to a child who had been taken from her and given to another family to raise as their own. She had threatened to go to the newspapers, to expose the order, and within a week she was locked away in the sanatorium, where she was subjected to treatments that were designed not to heal but to silence. She died of what the records called heart failure, though Daniel suspected it was something else, something deliberate. They were so close to having enough to tell the story, to piece together a narrative that would finally give voice to the women who had been erased, to the victims who had been dismissed as liars or lunatics. But they were missing one crucial element. They needed proof that the order had continued beyond the 1920s, that its influence had reached into the present, that the families who had tried so hard to hide their history were still protecting something. And then Margaret remembered the box. She had assumed that the watch was the only thing inside the mahogany box she had found in Eleanor Whitmore's library, but now she wondered if she had missed something. She went back to the Whitmore estate, which was still being prepared for the final auction, and she found the box where she had left it, on a shelf in the room that was serving as a temporary storage area. She brought it back to her apartment and examined it carefully, feeling along the velvet lining, pressing on the wooden base, looking for anything that might be hidden. And she found it, a false bottom, so well crafted that it was almost invisible, held in place by tiny brass pins that released when she pressed them in the right sequence. Beneath the false bottom was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with age, covered in handwriting that she recognized from the samples of Robert Whitmore's correspondence she had seen in the archives. It was a letter, dated March 15, 1923, addressed to my daughter, Eleanor, on the occasion of her 10th birthday. The letter was not a birthday greeting. It was a confession, a warning, and a plea. Robert Whitmore wrote that he was dying, that he had liver cancer and had only weeks left, and that he needed to tell Eleanor the truth before it was too late. He wrote that he had been part of something terrible, something that had begun with good intentions, a belief that men of wealth and education had a responsibility to guide society, but had become corrupted by power and arrogance and lust. He wrote that he had witnessed crimes, that he had participated in covering them up, that he had betrayed his own conscience and his faith in God, and that he could not die without acknowledging his guilt. He named names, 12 men including himself, and he described what they had done. The coercion, the assaults, the children born in secret and given away, the women who had been silenced and institutionalized and, in at least 2 cases, killed. He wrote that the order had disbanded in 1922 after one of its members, a man named Charles Devereux, had threatened to confess everything to a prosecutor who was investigating financial corruption in the state government. Devereux had been found dead in his study, an apparent suicide, though Robert wrote that he knew it had been murder, arranged by the remaining members to protect themselves. After that, the others had agreed to destroy all evidence of the order's existence, to swear an oath of silence, and to ensure that their descendants did the same. Robert Whitmore wrote that he was giving Eleanor the watch and the letter because he wanted her to know the truth, even if she could never speak it. He wrote that he hoped she would forgive him, though he did not deserve forgiveness, and he asked her to keep the watch hidden, to never let anyone find it, because if the truth came out, the families who had been part of the order would do anything to suppress it, even if it meant harming her. The letter ended with a single line: "I am sorry for the darkness I have brought into this world, and I pray that the light I sought was not a lie." Margaret read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking, tears blurring her vision. This was it. This was the proof they needed, written in the hand of one of the men who had perpetrated these crimes, confessing not just to his own guilt but to the guilt of the entire order. She called Daniel immediately, and they met at his office within the hour. When he read the letter, his face went pale, and he said, very quietly, that this changed everything. With this letter and the watch and the documents they had already gathered, they could tell a complete story, they could name the guilty, they could honor the forgotten victims. But they had to be careful. They had to assume that the descendants of these families would respond the way they had responded every other time someone had tried to expose the truth, with lawyers, with threats, with money and influence and the kind of power that came from generations of entrenched privilege. Margaret asked him what he thought they should do, and Daniel said that they needed to make the story public in a way that couldn't be suppressed, that they needed to give copies of everything to journalists, to historians, to archivists, to create a record that would survive even if they didn't. Margaret nodded, and they began to plan. They contacted a journalist at a national newspaper who specialized in historical investigations, a woman named Rachel Kim who had a reputation for thoroughness and fearlessness. They sent her encrypted files containing scans of every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence they had collected, along with a detailed timeline and narrative summary. Rachel responded within 24 hours, saying that she wanted to meet with them, that she believed the story was significant, but that she would need to verify everything independently before publication. They agreed, and over the next 6 weeks, Rachel conducted her own investigation, interviewing descendants, requesting documents from archives, consulting with experts in legal history and women's studies and the sociology of secret societies. And then, on a Tuesday morning in late November, the story appeared on the front page of the newspaper's website, with a full-length feature article, a timeline, photographs of the watch and the letter, and interviews with historians who confirmed that the evidence was credible and significant. The headline read, "The Order of the Eternal Light: How a Secret Society of Gilded Age Elites Concealed Crimes Against Women for a Century." The response was immediate and explosive. The story was picked up by television networks, by podcasts, by academic journals. Descendants of the families named in the letter issued statements, some denying any knowledge of the order, others apologizing for their ancestors' actions, a few threatening legal action against the newspaper and everyone involved in the investigation. But the evidence was too strong, too well documented, too carefully verified. The story could not be suppressed. Within days, the New Hampshire Attorney General announced that his office would review the historical evidence to determine if any current legal actions could be taken, though he acknowledged that most of the crimes described were beyond the statute of limitations. Several universities announced that they would revise their histories to include the story of the order and its victims. A coalition of women's rights organizations announced plans to create a memorial to the women who had been harmed, to ensure that their names and their stories would not be forgotten again. And Margaret Holloway, who had started all of this by finding a watch in a dusty library, stood in her apartment one evening, holding the small golden object in her hand, and thought about Eleanor Whitmore, who had kept her father's secret for more than 90 years, who had died alone in a decaying mansion rather than betray a promise made in childhood, and who had, perhaps, left the watch where it could be found because she understood that some promises should be broken, that some secrets should be told, that the light, whatever that meant, could not be eternal if it was built on lies and suffering and silence. Margaret opened the watch one last time, looked at the symbol engraved inside, the all-seeing eye that had once represented power and hidden knowledge, and she thought that maybe, just maybe, it could now represent something else. The truth, finally brought into the light, where everyone could see it, where it could never be hidden again. She closed the watch gently and placed it back in its box, knowing that it would soon be donated to a museum, where it would become part of the public record, a testament to the courage of those who had spoken and the resilience of those who had survived. And as she turned off the lamp and sat in the darkness of her small apartment, listening to the sounds of the city outside her window, she felt something she had not expected to feel: peace, and the quiet certainty that she had done something that mattered, something that would outlast her, something that honored the forgotten and held the powerful accountable, even if it had taken more than a century for justice to finally, imperfectly, arrive.